So what's the aim of the talk? Well, it's not actually to teach you how to draw. That would be impossible in less than an hour anyway, and without actually having drawing exercises. But the idea is to, the aim is that at the end of this session, you will appreciate and enjoy drawing a bit more than you did before, and enjoy drawing as an art form to appreciate, and also hopefully as an activity as well. Now, just a little warning, it would be impossible to give a lecture about drawing and the history of, or the art of drawing without some nudity. So I'll just see, no one's suddenly left, that's good, all right. So we're all open-minded. There's not too much, but yeah, you can see a little bit on the opening slide by Albrecht Dürer there. All right. So, oh, that's interesting. Why is that not letting me? There we go. Okay, so there are 5 parts to this talk. First of all, why do many adults struggle with drawing? 2 modes of thinking and perceiving. Why do artists draw? Why do artists draw nudes? And also some reflections on my own drawing. So, why do many adults struggle with drawing? Well, as soon as we realize that we can leave a trace, for example, in sand or on a fogged up window, we do as children. And it's okay that the result is impermanent, sometimes extremely impermanent, as in drawing with sparklers. And it's not just something that children do. Here's the famous Pablo Picasso drawing, and of course it was then made a bit more permanent by a photographer. So drawing at its essence is a direct trace of movement, as this example shows. Sometimes we draw, even if we don't think of ourselves as artists, we draw absent-mindedly. And what do we call that?
Doodling.
We call it doodling. And this is a real piece of doodling that I did during a meeting at the art gallery a number of years ago. And you might think, oh, it must have been a boring meeting, but it wasn't. It's just that sometimes it helps people to think if they engage their hand and a part of their mind in a kind of mindless or pseudo-mindless activity. So it's not really boredom as such. Now, another kind of drawing leaving a trace is the signature. It's a kind of personal drawing. Now, these are 8 alternative signatures, and none of them are, in fact, my real signature. It was just me imagining what it could look like if I had a different kind of personality. What kind of signature might I come up with? And so we could actually imagine, for example, the top right-hand signature might be from a Jonathan Cooper who's rather introverted. It's sometimes suggested that a backward slant on your writing, and in particular your signature, indicates someone who's a bit more introverted. The bottom left-hand one is perhaps one who's creative or wants people to think that he's creative. I don't know. Anyway, speaking of revealing personality, self-portrait drawings reveal the self probably more than paintings, and I think it's probably because it's more direct. It's faster, and somehow it seems to be more of a direct connection to personality. But the question is, if drawing is so natural and so basic, why do most of us not do it? Children do it. So what happens between childhood and adulthood? So here are some stages of development in drawing. at about the age of 2 years, it's basically just scribble, just noticing a child noticing that he or she can make marks on a surface, hopefully paper, sometimes walls or whatever. Then about a year later, about the age of 3, the child learns to control the scribble to a certain extent. So they can actually work out not just how to start, but how to stop. So, and then what happens is that the scribble, and it's to do with the movement of the joints, the shoulder joint and so on, that a lot of the marks they make are circular. And what happens is that these circular marks are recognized by the child, but more significantly by the adults around the child. And they say, oh, what's that? Or who's that? Oh, I can see a face. And so the child is encouraged to make an association between what are really abstract marks on a piece of paper and something representational. And, oh, is that mummy? Is that daddy? Is that you? And so on. So certain shapes, in particular the circular shapes, become used for different things. So you can see in this drawing, they're used for the eyes, the ears, even the fingers, the hands, and so on, the circular shape. So it's about assigning the meaning. This happens around the age of 4 years. Then we have storytelling, ages 6 to 8. So as you can see, it's becoming more complex, even greater complexity by the age of 10. Then around the age of 12, just before the teenage years, there's attempted realism. And you can see in this example, this attempt at, quite a good attempt in this case, at perspective. But the thing is, not long after this, there's a crisis, because the child becomes aware of the chasm between what they're trying to achieve and what they can see in other images, in particular photographic imagery, but also drawings and paintings by real artists. So what happens then is either abandonment or development. Abandonment is the lower arrow. The development is the upper arrow, and this is an example of a portrait by a child aged about 16. So that's the reason why why few adults draw and feel confident about drawing is because of a crisis that they had around the pre-teen years, where perhaps someone might have said to them, well, drawing's not really your thing, and there's that sense of embarrassment. So often when someone's asked to draw something as an adult, draw a person, they'll actually go even further back. They'll draw stick figures. They'll go further back than they were at age 12. I believe it's important for everyone to draw, and not because I think everyone should be a professional artist, but drawing is a way of seeing without labeling. And I'll explain what I mean. This is the cover of a very influential book by Betty Edwards called Drawing on the Right Side of the Brain. It came out in 1986, but it's had a few later editions since then, and I checked just yesterday. It's definitely still in print, definitely with an updated cover. The subtitle is How to Unlock Your Hidden Artistic Talent. So the basic premise of Drawing on the Right Side of the Brain is that there are literally two sides to the brain. The left, which she identifies as logical, sequential, rational, analytical, objective, verbal, and looking at parts. And the right side of the brain, which is intuitive, random, irrational, synthesizing, subjective, non-verbal, and looking at wholes rather than at parts. Now, neuroscientists now don't actually believe there's necessarily a direct and clear relationship between the two hemispheres of the brain and two modes of thinking, but the general principles still apply. So let's call them instead the verbal and non-verbal modes. Now here's a simple demonstration of it. Now I want you to, just to yourself, name these 6 colours. So there's no need to unmute if you're muted. So we see green, red, blue, yellow, black, and orange. At least that's what it should look like on your monitor. So that was very easy, right? Now, something that should be just as easy, but it's not. I want you to say the colours of the words, not the words themselves.
Green,
all right?
red, blue, yellow.
Green, red, blue, yellow, black, orange. Now, did you notice a conflict going on in your mind where you had to pause for a little bit because you immediately wanted to say the words, but you had to correct yourself. In fact, you may have even said green. You may have actually had to correct yourself. So what's the relevance to drawing? Well, the verbal mode, which negotiates the world with names and labels, wants to take over. It's like when you look at someone, perhaps to draw them, this is kind of what you see. Not literally what you see, but it's like a bunch of named parts. There's the hair, there are the eyes, there are the ears, and so on. So this is how the verbal mode sees, in this case, the upper body of a person. In Drawing on the Right Side of the Brain, the author, Betty Edwards, describes an experiment that she conducted. 4 junior high school students were asked to draw a person from memory. And you can see the results here, students 1, 2, 3, and 4. Then students 1 and 2 were asked to copy this drawing, which is Pablo Picasso's portrait of Igor Stravinsky. Then students 3 and 4 were asked to copy the same drawing, but upside down. And here are the results. And just to remind you what their drawings from memory look like, I've put them on the side, but then on the very right-hand side, you can see their copies of the Picasso drawing. Students 1 and 2 definitely struggled, particularly with the crossed legs and the foreshortening, whereas 3 and 4 were more accurate. Why? What difference should it make drawing something the right way up or upside down? And here's a quote from Drawing on the Right Side of the Brain, which is so clearly written that I think it's worth reading in full, that it explains what's going on. What prevents a person from seeing things clearly enough to draw them? Part of the answer is that from childhood, we've learned to see things in terms of words. We name things and we know facts about them. The dominant left verbal hemisphere doesn't want too much information about things it perceives, just enough to recognize and to categorize. The left brain, in this sense, learns to take a quick look and says, right, that's a chair or whatever. Because the brain is overloaded most of the time with incoming information, it seems that one of its functions is to screen out a large proportion of incoming perceptions. This is a necessary process to enable us to focus our thinking, and one that works very well for us most of the time. But drawing requires that you look at something for a long time, perceiving lots of details. The left hemisphere has no patience with this detailed perception and says, in effect, it's a chair, I tell you. That's enough to know. In fact, don't bother to look at it because I've got a ready-made symbol for you. Here it is. Add a few details if you want, but don't bother me with this looking business. So you might be interested to know what are some useful techniques to encourage non-verbal seeing or drawing, tasks that the verbal mode is either not good at or not interested in. One is blind contour drawing. Some of you may have heard of this. It's where you look at something that you're going to draw, and you only look at it. You don't look at the piece of paper that you're drawing on. So if you're drawing the side of a person's head, then you create a line on the paper that follows that curve. You go out for the ear and come back in again, but you don't look at the page, because when you look at the page, then you're correcting yourself, and it's much easier to go back to the symbols. Another one is drawing the spaces between things. So, for example, if someone is standing with their hands on their hips, they make a nice triangular shape. So that's one shape that you might actually draw rather than the arm or the torso. Going back to chairs, as in that quote, just a single chair, viewed not directly front on, actually has, particularly if it has a number of cross pieces, has some very interesting shapes. And as you turn it round, those shapes change. So that's another way of turning off the verbal mode that says it's a chair, there are the four legs, that's all you need to know. Another one is what is sometimes called vase double face drawing. So you draw, and this is assuming that you're a right-handed person. If you're a left-handed, then it's the other way around. But if you're a right-handed person, you draw a profile of a face facing to the right. Then on the right-hand side, you do the profile facing left. But the idea is that you're not actually drawing a profile now, you're just completing the vase shape, right? So that the aim is the symmetry. So as you watch the curve of what we recognize as the forehead going in like that, you just match that shape the other way. So again, you're turning off the verbal part, the verbal mode of your brain that is trying to recognize things. You're just thinking about the shapes. This conflict between the verbal and non-verbal modes affects even famous artists. This is an early work by Vincent van Gogh, and it demonstrates a common problem with proportion. Can anyone see what the problem is? And if you have your microphones muted, you might want to unmute them. Anyone see what the
hand
the hands
is the wrong
do look
side.
big, which is actually not that common a mistake. In fact, a lot of people make the opposite mistake when they're learning drawing. They make the hands too small, and it's actually a surprise to people to say, okay, put your hand over your face. Notice how much of the face it covers. Anyway, but that, yes, that is, I mean, that may have been intentional because this carpenter is actually using his hands, but it's something
not in proportion.
It's too big.
Length
the
is-
head, well, it's actually, the head's not too big, the face is too big. The head is actually, it appears cut off. And the reason for that is that faces are inherently interesting. And they say that a newborn baby actually has this hard wiring that is looking out for things that look like faces. And we still do it now, you know, in a abstract pattern in a tile or something, we see two dots and we go, you know, they're like eyes. So because faces are inherently interesting, there's a symbol for every feature. And so the rest of the head, you know, the whole back part is less important and therefore perceived as smaller, even though it's not. Okay, why do artists draw? Well, those who do. There are some contemporary artists that claim that drawing is actually not that important, but a lot of artists, even ones that whose drawings you don't actually see exhibited in art galleries, do draw. So here are 4 reasons, and there may be others. First of all, in my list, for public viewing, so as artworks in their own right. And the Australian artist Lloyd Rees was particularly well known for that. And here's a marvelously detailed and very well composed drawing of a rock face at Waverton, North Sydney. Secondly, to study an object, usually a figure, for a painting. And this is Antoine Watteau's study of a nude man holding bottles. Now, I'm not sure of the actual painting that this was a study for, but I'm presuming that the finished painting didn't have a nude man in it. And so I'm anticipating what we're going to be talking about a bit later, why do artists draw nudes? Okay. Thirdly, to plan a composition for a painting. Can anyone recognise what painting this might be the plan for?
Is it on it? Last Supper.
The Last Supper by Leonardo da Vinci. And I was actually lucky enough to see this drawing a number of years ago at the Art Gallery of New South Wales. They had an exhibition. Some of you may have seen it as well. An exhibition of drawings by Leonardo da Vinci, and I remember the feeling that I had seeing this was that I had instinctively imagined that there was only one way that Leonardo da Vinci could have painted the Last Supper, which is the way that it looks now. But seeing this made me realise Leonardo da Vinci was an artist who had to decide, oh, am I going to have all the figures on one side? Notice here there's someone, actually seems rather small, but someone on the closer side of the table. He also experimented with having someone right next to Jesus actually slumped over the table, which obviously he abandoned in the finished painting. So it's quite an interesting experience being able to see the creative process in drawing for something as familiar as the Last Supper. And fourthly, in my list, for practice and or personal pleasure. And this is Rembrandt's drawing of possibly the famous elephant Hansken from a Dutch zoo in the 17th century. Okay. And speaking of elephants, what is the elephant in the room with regard to drawing? What is it?
An elephant.
Well, the elephant in the room is nudes. And it's a question that people often ask or think of asking, but perhaps don't actually say. Why do artists draw nudes? Well, the conventional answer is, if you're going to paint a person clothed, you need to know what's going on under the clothes. And it's for a related reason that many artists study human anatomy, because they say, well, it's one thing to be able to see the skin, but what's going on under the skin? So you as an artist, you study the bones and the muscles and the fat and so on, so that you can understand why the arm is turning in this particular way and so on. So fair enough. And it's often used to deflect questions, sometimes muttered under one's breath, about artists drawing people with no clothes on. In other words, it's supposed to be completely non-sexual. And, you have to wonder, well, is that actually the case? Well, probably no, because even subjects other than the human body can be very sensual, such as the trunk of this tree. This is another Lloyd Rees drawing of a Port Jackson fig tree. And perhaps it's a bit too obvious an example, because the tree, the trunk and the branches actually look rather like limbs of the body. But in fact, landscape can be as sensual as a naked body, sometimes literally. Now, this is actually a photograph, not a drawing, by David Moore, called Landscape Nude, #1. But here's a painting by the late, great Central Coast-based painter Robin Norling, who was a champion of drawing. And this is called Bungle's Bungle. So there are actually two reasons why drawing is an especially sensual art form. First of all, the drawn line created by the artist's hand represents touch, and touch is a connection. So the pencil on paper sort of parallels the hand or the eye, actually the eye on flesh. In fact, it's more complex than that. So here we have the artist, the model, the artist's hand and drawing tool, and the piece of paper. So what happens when an artist is drawing? Well, the artist looks at the model and at the piece of paper. The artist controls the hand and the drawing tool. The drawing tool makes marks on paper. Then the artist imagines the drawing tool following the contours of the model. The drawing becomes a representation of the model, and as time goes on, the artist turns more and more of his or her attention to the drawing. Now, there's another reason why drawing is a sensual activity. See, in history, the rise of drawing as an art form in its own right coincides with a move in society from the public to the private. In the Middle Ages, many activities that are now performed only in private were done out in the open, in full view. Now, a recurring theme in drawings is everyday private activities, especially washing or drying of the body or hair. Now, although the French Impressionists, for example, Degas, in this case, this is a drawing, of course, although the French Impressionists eventually made this kind of subject acceptable in European painting, it actually been well established in drawing since the 16th century. And when we look at drawings like this, it feels a bit like spying on a stranger. We can feel a voyeuristic thrill, even if the activity we're witnessing is not at all sexual. And here's another Degas work. This is a oil pastel work that shows a high viewpoint, and you can tell that it's a high viewpoint, especially by the shape of the tub that she's sitting in. It's not a very flat ellipse, but it's almost tending towards a circle, as though we're looking down on it. So this emphasizes the closeness and intimacy. Now, the thing about voyeurism is that the subject shouldn't be aware of you, the viewer. There's a sense in which the artist is stealing the model's privacy. Now, drawing may be very natural, going right back to childhood, but life drawing as an activity is quite artificial when you think about it. The rules, mostly unwritten, even unstated, are, first of all, think of the model as an object, and the model should do likewise. And two, avoid eye contact if possible. And in fact, speaking of eye contact, just think about what happens if some stranger meets your gaze on a train. Rather an extreme example, I admit. You feel quite awkward. It's very difficult to actually return the gaze, and you sort of want to look away. Imagine how much more awkward it would be if the other person were naked. And yet, there is one kind of image where a naked person meets our gaze, and hopefully you won't be offended by this image. I'm referring to softcore pornography. Notice I said image, not artwork. This look that the model has on her face is called the come and get me look. She's looking directly at the camera and hence at us, her lips pouting or slightly parted, and the pose indicates an openness or immediate availability. But here's an interesting alternative from the history of art. This is Edouard Manet's famous Luncheon on the Grass of 1863. Now, instead of the come and get me look, we have the what are you looking at look. It's defiance rather than passivity, challenge rather than availability. Now, there's an important extra element in this painting. The woman is naked, but the men are dressed, and they're dressed in contemporary clothes. This implies that she's not a pagan goddess or a nymph, which would have made her acceptable to polite society, but probably a sex worker. Another possibility is for the model, in this case a girl, to be naked and vulnerable, trying to protect herself from us. And therefore, how are we meant to feel? We're expected to feel a bit uncomfortable, a bit guilty. And this is by Edvard Munch, famous for his painting The Scream. Another reason why artists depict the nude, especially in drawing, is that it's symbolic of the raw self and one's place in the universe. Therefore, how the body is depicted shows the artist's worldview. For example, ideal beauty and perfection in this painting of The Sleeping Venus by Giorgione. Or at the other extreme, the anti-ideal, the stiff, awkward, angular, almost jaundiced image of this model sitting with on a chair, John Brack's nude with two chairs. However, there's another option as well. It doesn't have to be ideal or anti-ideal. This painting by the English artist Lucian Freud, who was grandson of Sigmund Freud, might look like another anti-ideal. The flesh is mottled and lumpy, and even the couch is lumpy and decaying. But in fact, it's a portrait of a named person. It's called Benefit Supervisor Sleeping, in brackets, Sue Tilley. And in fact, the subject, Sue Tilley, posed for a photograph in front of the painting at the National Portrait Gallery in London. So it's not an ideal or an anti-ideal, but a realistic or naturalistic depiction of the human body, and definitely in your face. Now, before I finish, I realise I'm actually a bit under time here, but anyway, hopefully that means there's time for questions. I'd like to show you some drawings of mine which I've done over the past few years. Not because I have any particular special talent, but because as the creator, I have a special understanding of the aims and techniques behind each example. So here's a series of four very quick drawings, each 30 seconds. Now, you might wonder why do a drawing just for 30 seconds. And these were in fact from a life drawing group that I belong to at Kincumber School of Arts. And we always start with, well, actually, normally we start with 1 minute drawings, but for some reason, these were 30-second drawings. Now, obviously, if you've only got 30 seconds to draw a pose, you have to be very selective and choose only the main gestures. So, for example, in the bottom drawing, I noticed that the model seemed to form a circle, and so I emphasized that. I actually drew a circle over the body. And with the other ones, I actually showed how some of the lines were more significant to me than others. And in fact, this idea of doing very quick drawings and the idea of selectivity is quite important, even for drawings that you have a bit longer for. This one, in fact, is, I had a full minute to do this one, and I decided to show only the main lights and darks. But it's sometimes, there's been a comparison sometimes between drawing and packing a suitcase for a holiday, because you know that when you are going on holidays, you can't actually take everything that you will possibly need for the holiday. You have to actually decide, well, this is more important than that. I'm going to leave that aside. And I think that's where a lot of people get stuck with drawing, is that they feel as though they have to put absolutely everything in there, which is not to say that you shouldn't look very closely, but you don't have to burden yourself with this idea that it has to actually show everything. So here's another drawing where I actually decided I wasn't even going to try to do the whole figure. So I concentrated on just the back of the neck, the shoulders, the upper arm, and the back. Another possibility, this is a 2-minute drawing, you don't have to actually show every edge, because that's an interesting thing with drawing. The viewer's mind will actually complete the figure. Again, when we're, as viewers, we tend to interpret even abstract shapes as things that we recognize. So in some ways, it's the left brain, the verbal side, actually coming to our rescue. We're trying to find things that are recognizable. In this drawing here, I decided to simplify some of the forms, some of the shapes. So, for example, the breast, obviously I know the breast is not made of straight lines, but it helped to create a unity if I had some lines which echoed some other lines in the drawing. Now there is actually a bit of a curve there and a curve there, so perhaps I wasn't being totally consistent in this. Another interesting thing is, instead of making lines all one thickness, it can make a drawing more interesting and expressive if lines have different thicknesses or weights. If you press down harder in some places and have a much lighter touch in others. And these can reflect what parts of the drawing seem to be more significant than others. Now there's something interesting going on here with the leg, which is actually even more apparent in this next drawing. And that's when one line goes behind another. For example, with the right leg here, it creates an illusion of 3 dimensions. And it also prevents the feeling that the drawing is just a shape to be filled in. And this is one of my bugbears with colouring in books. A lot of people think, because of experiences with colouring in, that that's really what drawing is. You do the outline and then you come back and you fill in the colour in the centre. Whereas the real world isn't about edges which are filled in. It's about contours which wrap around other contours and so on. And it, as I said, it helps to create that illusion of 3 dimensions. This was an experiment, just a 2-minute drawing, with a different kind of line quality. The sort of nervous and shaky lines, not continuous lines. I mean, you may wonder, was I feeling nervous, or was I feeling a kind of nervousness in the model? Probably neither. As I said, it was just an experiment to see what would happen. Another experiment was with shading. Rather than using hatching, which is, from top right to bottom left, usually for a right-handed person, or cross-hatching, where you go back the other way to do shadows, I decided to shade with lines that seem to follow the 3-dimensional form. So you can see those lines are going across the back, and then these lines are going around the body and tucking under, around the body and tucking under. In this leg, notice how the curves, the lines are curving around that way, but in this leg, they're curving the other way, because this leg is going away from us, this leg is coming towards us. So I was trying to show the body sort of tunneling through space, tunneling into space, or coming out at us. So it's an example of foreshortening too. You might sometimes hear the advice, light colours stand out, dark colours recede, and warm colours come forward and cool colours go back. But the truth is, it's actually changes of colour or tone, that's light or dark, which come forward and show change of direction. And so, for example, notice the knees, how there's a change because there's light there. I changed the tone, made it dark on the knee and again here, and that shows the change of direction of the leg. And you also may notice that I've done this drawing on grey paper. Can anyone think of why it would be a good idea to draw at least sometimes on grey paper? Anybody?
Yeah.
Got a ready-made medium tone.
Okay, you have a ready-made medium tone, that's right, which means that you start from the middle and then you add marks that show the dark, you add marks that show the light. Whereas when you start with a bright white piece of paper, you're starting at one extreme, and everything that you do is making it darker and darker. It's a little bit like the difference between carving in sculpture, where you're starting with a block, and so everything you do is taking away, or modelling, where you have an armature and you have clay and you can add bits on, but then you can also take bits away. So it's a lot more fluid. It does actually take a little bit more time though, because you have to think about the lights and the darks and how they relate to each other. Again, an example of lines going in front of other lines, so that the side of the back here and how it goes behind it goes in front of the thigh goes behind there, which creates more solidity. And also notice again this dark patch on the elbow, which indicates that the form is changing direction. It kind of sometimes feels like a bit of a trick, because in fact sometimes I'll put a change of tone even if I don't actually see it, which is important to remember. There is actually a difference between drawing and photography. You're not necessarily drawing exactly what you see, but because what you see is a two-dimensional, but you know it's a three-dimensional form in front of you. Okay, sometimes I draw the same model, the same pose from the same viewpoint twice. So we actually had 30 minutes for this pose, and I decided to do a 5-minute version and then a 25-minute version. And I'm not sure necessarily that the 25-minute version is 5 times better than the 5-minute version. And it's interesting, I belong to a life drawing group in Canada. My 2 daughters live on Vancouver Island, and one of the daughters actually runs a life drawing group, and they have a Facebook group, and we're invited to post our drawings. So I post the drawings that I do back here in Australia, and it's interesting that I seem to get more likes for the drawings that are 1, 2, maybe 5 minutes than I do for the ones that are 20 or 30 minutes, which is interesting. So maybe I tend to sort of overload my drawings a bit as I keep working on them. As you can see, I really like backs, and maybe because the back has a subtle surface, but also because the back doesn't have those kind of labels that as many labels as the front of a figure. So, okay, we might talk about the shoulder blades and the spine, and that's about, and the shoulders themselves. But for the vast majority, the majority of the area here, you just have to say, okay, it's coming forward a bit, now it's going across, now it's going down, or there's a bit of a lump here that's catching the light. So it actually encourages turning off that verbal side and just concentrating on the forms as you see them. Sometimes I place myself so that the light comes from behind the model, as you can see in this example. So it creates this effect where the edges on one side become stronger and the edges on the other side become subtler. You might also notice that you get an effect such as with this arm here, where you have light and then dark and then light again. So light, in fact, is not just coming from the one direction, from the window, but light also bounces off other things. So it can bounce off the floor up into the arm. It can even bounce off one part of the body onto another. And that's even more apparent with this example. So you can see how the top surface of the calf looks almost glossy, and how light reflecting off the abdomen actually illuminates part of the arm. And another example of backlighting. And again, you'll see that I've used the shading with lines following the form. So the turban wrapping around the head, and then the back going up and over the shoulders. And a few words about composition. You don't normally think about composition with drawing, because usually when you draw, the only worry that you have about the edge of the paper is that you want to make sure you fit everything in. So, you know, you don't do the head and thinking that you're going to fit the whole figure in, and oh damn, I don't have enough room for the foot. But generally speaking, it's the body, you know, in a sea of paper. But it's actually good to think about how the body and other objects, if there's time, how they relate to the rectangle and to each other. So again, if time permits, obviously it's a bit harder to do this for a 1 or 2 minute drawing, but if time permits, you can create a complete composition. So the placement of every form looks pleasing and right. And actually, sometimes I draw a rectangle inside the paper after I draw the model. So you don't necessarily have to assume that the rectangle of the piece of paper is the rectangle that you have to work with. So for example, in this drawing, notice how the line from the top of the leg points to the edge of the skirting board on the back wall, how the right-hand edge of the cloth points to the door jamb, and how the left forearm points to the top right-hand corner of the picture. So, to summarize, here are the 5 things that I was going to said I was going to talk about. Why do many adults struggle with drawing? Well, it's because of the crisis that we all had as teenagers, where we began to doubt our abilities. And if that's something that we've never really dealt with, then we're going to continue to say to ourselves and to each other, I'm not really an artistic kind of person, I don't draw. The 2 modes of thinking and perceiving, well, there's the verbal, the normally dominant one, and the verbal, which is survival vision. The verbal is survival vision, the non-verbal is aesthetic vision, looking at things for the sheer pleasure of it. Why do artists draw? Well, as an artwork in its own right, to study, usually the figure, to plan a composition, or for pleasure and or for practice. Why do artists draw nudes? Well, it's the sensual connection between the drawn line and the sense of touch, the idea of intimacy and the gaze, and also how it's how artists can show their worldview, the ideal or the anti-ideal or the non-ideal. And yes, some reflections on my own drawing: be selective. If there's only one piece of advice that you remember from this, is you don't have to draw everything. You don't have to do everything in a drawing. In fact, I remember when I was at art school many years ago, our drawing class wasn't actually called drawing. It was called graphic communication one, which I thought was a little bit over the top. But I remember that our drawing teacher actually said, when he gave us some exercises to do, he actually said, don't think of this as being drawing. You're just doing a task that I'm giving you to do. And one task, for example, he gave was just to look at and draw every vertical line that you can see in the model or the still life or whatever we were drawing, and just put those on the page. Now look at all the horizontal lines. Now all the oblique lines going in this direction, now all the oblique lines going in that direction. Don't worry whether it looks like the thing, you're just studying the visual things that you can see in front of you, and you're making marks. And the amazing thing is, of course, that what ended up on our paper did actually look a bit like what we were looking at, a bit like the model, or a bit like the still life or the landscape or something. So in some ways, the word drawing tends to scare people off a bit. And it's interesting, the people that had the most trouble with this drawing teacher's exercises were ones who had, who were the most realistic drawers. The people that could naturally draw things very realistically, because all of a sudden they were being asked to give up their natural advantage and go back to square one, and they didn't like that. Whereas for me, I didn't feel as though I had any particular advantage, so I was quite happy for the liberation that it gave me. So I have a website which is called Dr. Dada, but you'll actually find it at unwrappingart.com. I actually have two websites, but the one that's drdada.com is partly broken at the moment. So I'm going to eventually merge the two together. But you can see more examples of my drawings if you are interested. And also there's some articles about art, including some drawing. If you can't remember this URL, just remember unwrappingart.com and then go to the art section, and then you'll see a page under that called Life Drawing. And also, if you go to the blog section, there's also some shorter articles on art and including drawing as well.